In this video, I'm going to be talking about climate change in Bible prophecy, including the cause of climate change, why the world's efforts to combat climate change are going to fail, and how this is going to lead to the 7 last plagues and Jesus' second coming. But before I do that, I want to thank Amazing Facts for sponsoring this video. Amazing Facts is one of my favorite Christian ministries, and they have a free app that you can download for iOS or Android, which includes sermons, Bible studies, Bible questions answered, a Christian blog, and more. Click on the link in the video description to download the Amazing Facts app today. An online post by VaticanNews.va entitled Pope on Climate Crisis, Time is Running Out, Decisive Action Needed, states, Pope Francis on Friday meets with participants attending a summit entitled The Vatican Dialogues, the Energy Transition and Care for Our Common Home. In comments to the group, he warns that today's ecological crisis, especially climate change, threatens the very future of the human family and asks oil CEOs for a radical energy transition. The common consensus among climate scientists is that if we don't do something to decrease greenhouse gas emissions in the environment soon, destructive consequences will result on our planet, threatening our very existence. The science behind climate change claims that too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere lead to the greenhouse effect and global warming, which in turn leads to climate change in the form of more intense storms, droughts, fires, and rising sea levels from melting polar ice caps. The most concerning greenhouse gases include carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Now, there are both natural and human sources for these greenhouse gases, but the human sources are the ones I'm going to be discussing because they are the ones that concern climate scientists the most, since human activity has significantly increased the amount of these gases in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide comes mainly from burning fossil fuels for power, generation, and transport use. Major sources of methane include the production and combustion of natural gas and coal. And nitrous oxide sources include agriculture, fossil fuel combustion, and industrial processes. Now, whether you believe in the science behind climate change or not, it's hard to deny that something is happening. The climate is getting more volatile. For example, an online post from The Guardian entitled Glacial Melting in Antarctica May Become Irreversible states, recent research found the rate of ice loss from 5 Antarctic glaciers had doubled in 6 years and was 5 times faster than in the 1990s. So glaciers are melting at an alarming rate, and the negative impact that's going to have on the world, according to climate scientists, is rising sea levels which could flood coastal cities. The last few years have also seen catastrophic, record-breaking fires. For example, the Amazon fire. An online post by CNBC.com entitled The Amazon Rainforest is Still on Fire, Here's How You Can Help reads, Brazil's Amazon rainforest fires have caused global concern, and yet it could get even worse as the country's fire season is just getting started. Since January, more than 70,000 fires have been detected in Brazil's Amazon rainforest, up 84% from the number tracked in 2018, according to the country's National Institute for Space Research. This not only threatens the region's future, but could also speed up climate change, since the rainforest significantly helps reduce the world's carbon dioxide levels. In addition, annual record-breaking storms have become the norm. An online post by unocha.org entitled Category Hell, the new norm for storms in the Caribbean, says, look closely and it becomes apparent that recently, quite a few new storms have broken records. In 2015, Hurricane Joaquin, which devastated parts of the southern islands of the Bahamas, was the strongest Atlantic hurricane of non-tropical origin recorded in the satellite era. The following year, Hurricane Matthew battered Haiti, and again, parts of the Bahamas, becoming the first hurricane to sustain itself as a Category 4 for 5 days. In 2017, the hyperactive tropical cyclone season was the costliest on record. Hurricanes Irma and Maria tore through Dominica, Barbuda, the US, and British Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, and parts of Cuba in an unforgiving quick succession. Maria had the highest average rainfall of the 129 storms to have struck Puerto Rico in the past 60 years. Climate scientists attribute all of these disasters to global warming and say that unless we do something to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere soon, these disasters are only going to get worse. Some resolutions that have been proposed to combat global warming include renewable energy like solar farms and wind turbines, cleaner fuels, adopting a plant-rich diet, and planting trees. And once these resolutions are implemented on a global scale, what's going to happen is nothing. Nothing is going to happen. Bible prophecy warns us that natural disasters will continue to increase in frequency and intensity until the second coming of Jesus Christ. When Jesus' apostles asked him about signs preceding his return, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24 verses 7 through 8, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains." Birth pains is another way of saying contractions, the labor pains that a woman experiences before giving birth. Contractions get more frequent and intense the closer a pregnant woman gets to delivering her child. So the end-time signs which Jesus spoke about, like famines and earthquakes, will continue to increase as well. Jesus spoke of some more end-time signs in Luke chapter 21 verse 25, saying, "And there will be signs in the sun, in the moon, and in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations, with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." The sea and the waves roaring happens when there is a violent storm or a tsunami. And according to a commentary I read, Luke chapter 21 verse 25 in Greek indicates that the distress of nations and perplexity on the earth is a result of the sea and waves roaring. Some more modern versions of the Bible actually say that. For example, the NIV says, "On the earth, nations will be in anguish and perplexity at the roaring and tossing of the sea." And that reminds me of the climate crisis. We have these massive, record-breaking storms and natural disasters that people are perplexed over, and their best explanation for their cause is global warming. And this causes people anguish or distress because if they don't do something about it quick, it threatens their very existence. Now to back up a little bit, the reason why global warming resolutions aren't going to solve climate change is because they're not the cause of climate change, according to the Bible. People could install millions of solar panels and wind turbines and drive electric cars all over the world to cut down on greenhouse gases, but climate change is going to continue to get worse. Because according to the Bible, the cause of climate change is the sinfulness of man. For instance, in the context of the natural disasters that Jesus spoke about in Matthew chapter 24 and Luke chapter 21, in the context of the earthquakes, famines, and the sea and the waves roaring, Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24 verse 12, "And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." So where there's lawlessness, in other words, a disregard for God's law of 10 commandments, there's climate change. I'm going to talk about why in a minute, but before I do that, I want to give you some more examples of climate change being the result of the sinfulness of man in the Bible. The first example of climate change in the Bible was Noah's flood. According to the Bible, several thousand years ago, the world was destroyed by a global flood. The reason for this is given in Genesis chapter 6, verses 5 through 7 and 11. It says, "Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing, and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence." Mankind had become so sinful and corrupt in Noah's time that God had no choice but to destroy them with a flood and start over with Noah and his family. Therefore, the sinfulness of man in Noah's time brought about climate change in the form of the Great Flood. In Matthew chapter 24, verse 37, Jesus said, "But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be." The Great Flood was a judgment of God upon the wicked in Noah's day, and climate change is a judgment of God upon the wicked world that we live in today. The world is fast departing from God and passing laws legalizing recreational drug use, abortion, and homosexual marriage, to name a few. Crime, violence, and corruption are spiraling out of control, and as a result, the nations of the world are forfeiting the protection of God, and disasters occur. God's protection is conditional upon obedience to His word. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 4 verse 40 says, "You shall therefore keep His statutes and His commandments, which I command you today, that it may go well with you and with your children after you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which the Lord your God is giving you for all time." Now, in this verse, Moses was specifically talking to the Israelites who were about to receive the 10 Commandments, but that applies to Christians today as well. God still requires us to keep His 10 Commandments, and when we reject His law, we forfeit His protection. And when we forfeit His protection, we give Satan the right to wreak havoc in our lives. One of the ways Satan does this is through natural disasters. They should be called supernatural disasters because, really, there's nothing natural about them. They're the result of a vicious attack by a fallen angel. Ephesians chapter 2 verse 2 calls Satan the prince of the power of the air, which indicates that he has control of the elements to some degree. And he uses this power to destroy people who have forfeited God's protection to reap a harvest of souls for eternal damnation. And God allows this to happen, not only because people have forfeited God's protection, but in the hope that it will awaken them to their spiritual condition so they can repent and be saved. Jesus said in Revelation chapter 3 verse 19, "As many as I love I rebuke and chasten, therefore be zealous and repent." Another example of climate change in the Bible is the 3.5-year drought during Elijah the prophet's time. 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 1 says, "And Elijah the Tishbite of the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word." Ahab was the king of Israel, and the sin that he was guilty of was idol worship, and he led his kingdom into idolatry. 1 Kings chapter 18 verses 17 through 18 says, "Then it happened, when Ahab saw Elijah, that Ahab said to him, Is that you, O troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals." The 3.5-year drought in Israel ended only after the people of Israel turned back to God. This happened after Elijah's standoff with the false prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Verses 38 through 39 tell us, "Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice, and the wood, and the stones, and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God. Then, just a few verses later, in verse 45, it says, "Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain." You know what that tells us? If we want to end climate change, the world needs to turn back to God. I think sooner or later the world is going to come to that conclusion, especially when all the technology is implemented to reduce greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and natural disasters keep getting worse. Then people are going to figure out that greenhouse gases are not the problem and they're going to look for another cause. And who do you think they're going to turn to for answers? They're going to turn to the moral leader of the climate crisis. And who is the moral leader of the climate crisis? It's the Pope. An online post by VaticanNews.va entitled "Al Gore, Pope Francis is a moral force for solving climate crisis" demonstrates this. The Pope also got an endorsement from Greta Thunberg, a teenage climate activist who started a massive movement that consolidated young people all over the world to conduct climate strikes to convince politicians to make changes to combat climate change. Greta is a leading figure in climate activism. When she spoke in a climate rally in Montreal, Canada, approximately 500,000 people showed up. This was mentioned in an online post by DW.com entitled "Greta Thunberg leads 500,000 people at Montreal Climate Rally." Before that rally, Greta crossed paths with Pope Francis at the Vatican, holding a sign stating, "Join the climate strike, celebrate Laudato Si" on May 24. On May 24, climate strikes were conducted by students around the world, and it was also the 5th anniversary of Laudato Si. So it's evident that Pope Francis is seen as a leading moral authority on climate change by politicians and climate activists alike. And once all of the resolutions to combat climate change fail, and they will fail, people will turn to Pope Francis, or whoever the Pope is at the time, for answers. And he will turn to his encyclical on climate change, which tells them they need to rest and worship on Sunday to combat the climate crisis, because these are not merely natural disasters, they are the judgments of God against a disobedient generation. Page 237 in Laudato Si reads, "On Sunday, our participation in the Eucharist has special importance. Sunday, like the Jewish Sabbath, is meant to be a day which heals our relationships with God, with ourselves, with others, and with the world." A few sentences down, speaking about the seventh-day Sabbath, which the Pope calls the Jewish Sabbath, even though the Bible never calls it that, the Pope wrote, "The law of weekly rest forbade work on the seventh day, so that your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your maidservant and the stranger may be refreshed." The implication here is that we need to have a law mandating rest on Sunday, like there was a law mandating rest on the seventh day of the week for the Jews. And eventually, Sunday laws will be passed mandating rest and worship, but that's going to make the situation worse because Sunday is not the true Bible Sabbath. It's a counterfeit Sabbath, and this apostasy will lead to the 7 last plagues, the final judgments of God against the wicked. Afterwards, Jesus will return. By the way, I have some videos which go into more detail about the Sabbath, the mark of the beast, the second coming of Jesus, and other vital topics that you can watch by clicking on the card in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Climate change is real and observable. Natural disasters are getting more frequent and intense. Climate scientists attribute this to global warming, but the Bible reveals another cause, the sinfulness of man. All the existing technology to combat climate change will fail, and once that happens, the world will turn to the moral leader of the climate crisis, which is the Pope. The Pope will tell them that the cause of climate change is God's judgments, and in order to solve the climate crisis, we need to keep the Sabbath holy on Sunday. However, this will only make matters worse, since the Sunday Sabbath is a counterfeit Sabbath. It will plunge this world into total apostasy, and the 7 last plagues, the final judgments of God, will be poured out. Then Jesus will return. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new and click the bell so you don't miss any of my future uploads. Please pray for my channel that God may continue using it to reach people with vital end-time messages to prepare them for the return of the Lord. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.